During the 1880s, the U.S. encountered a mass migration of many Japanese moving to America. Approximately 400,000 Japanese immigrants migrated to the free world in hopes to live better lives. Some became farmers, some ran businesses, and some even served for the U.S. in our wars. Suddenly, in 1937, Japan declared war on China and invaded Manchuria. However, with America strongly against this aggression, they decided to respond harshly, with trade embargoes and economic sanctions. The oil embargo that America organized with the British and the Dutch was a thorn for Japan, which imported 90% of its oil. Without oil, Japan's military could not function and all war efforts might need to come to an end. By the spring of 1941, it was increasingly apparent that Japan and the United States would be enveloped in conflict. In response to this, Detroit businessman Curtis B. Munson commissioned as a special representative of the State Department on the sympathies and loyalties of Japanese Americans living in California and the west coast of the United States did a special report. This was a 29-page report written in 1940 and was submitted to the White House on October 7, 1941. The report was then presented to Franklin Delano Roosevelt on November 7, 1941. The report concluded that Japanese Americans are loyal and would pose little threat to the U.S. But then, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, about 2 months after the Munson reports came out. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese intended to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet with one swift blow, and they nearly succeeded. 18 U.S. warships were damaged or sunk during the assault, including 8 battleships, and 188 Army and Navy aircraft were destroyed. The human toll was even more brutal. 2,403 U.S. military personnel and civilians were killed, and 1,178 people were wounded. By contrast, the Japanese lost only 29 aircraft and suffered fewer than 100 casualties. So after witnessing the horrors at Pearl Harbor, Americans demanded retribution and entered World War II, yet fears of Japanese within American borders remained. In response to the conflict abroad and fear at home, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order authorized the evacuation of all persons deemed a threat to national security from the West Coast to the relocation centers further inland. They considered anyone of Japanese ancestry a threat, even though most of them had no criminal record. In the next 6 months, over 100,000 men, women, and children of Japanese ancestry were moved to assembly centers along the West Coast. The gathering of the Japanese was quite simple. The internment camps themselves were described as prison at home. Plain, cramped, poorly equipped housing, and tough living conditions. If anyone wanted to escape, they had military barracks, barbed wire, guard towers, and searchlights.
Well, first of all, the internment camp was, it was a forced evacuation. There were people who were not knowledgeable about the camps would make the comment that, we'll put there in for our protection, which is not the case. You had guard towers, you have barbed wire fence surrounding the camp, you have rifles pointing inward from the guard towers, the barbed wire fence on the top portion is facing inward to keep us in. It was not facing outward to keep outsiders from coming in. So I wanted to at least, lay that out.
The houses were described by the 1943 War Relocation Authority as tar paper covered barracks of simple frame construction without plumbing or cooking facilities of any kind. Even though most people evacuated the West Coast after Executive Order 9066 was signed, Fred Korematsu, a Japanese-American citizen, refused to attend an internment camp. Instead, he stayed at home with his Italian girlfriend. While hiding, Korematsu had plastic surgery to disguise his identity. He told locals that he was just a Mexican-American. Eventually, though, Korematsu was found and immediately sent to the Tan Foran internment camp in California. Korematsu then sought help from ACLU director and filed a lawsuit against the U.S. government, stating that his constitutional rights have been violated and that he had faced racial segregation. Later on, his case was sent to the Supreme Court. However, Korematsu was tried in federal court in San Francisco, convicted of violating military orders issued under Executive Order 9066 and given 5 years on probation, and sent to an assembly center in San Bruno, California. Even though he couldn't prove his case, some of the Supreme Court justices agreed with his cause. Frank Murphy, a Supreme Court justice, stated, "I repent. Therefore, from this legalization of racism, racial discrimination in any form is a degree it has no justifiable part whatever in our democratic way of life. It is unattractive in any setting, but it is utterly revolting among a free people who have embraced the principles set forth in the Constitution of the United States. All residents of this nation are kin in some way by blood or culture to a foreign land. Yet they are primarily and necessarily a part of the new and distinct civilization of the United States. They must, accordingly, be treated at all times as the heirs of the American experiment and entitled to all the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution. Another justice, Hugo Black, said that he should be noted, to begin with, that all legal restrictions which curtail with the civil rights of a single racial group are immediately suspect. After everything was done, the Supreme Court upheld Korematsu's case by a vote of 6-3. U.S. Major General Henry C. Pratt issued Public Proclamation No. 21, stating that starting January 2, 1945, Japanese American evacuees from the West Coast could return to their homes, meaning that the Japanese internment was finally over. After the Japanese internment concluded, there were many problems. Citizens started to not like the Japanese. For instance, many would hang signs on their house being racist toward the Japanese people.
When the war ended, I was 10 years old, and I did face some of that, especially in school. I grew up in the first 3 years after camp. We lived in Norwalk, California, and I did, have racial problems there.
Short-term problems existed through an economical lens. For instance, a study shows that those internees who were sent to richer regions where the population earned close to the median income had better opportunities upon release and did better economically than those who were sent to poorer places. Internees who were sent to wealthier locations earned more and were likely to complete college and work in higher status careers. Those who were put in poor, rural areas far away from cultural centers received less education, lived in worse housing, and earned less money. In addition, Japanese Americans had lost many possessions and valuables. This is because prior to the internment, Japanese Americans left some of their possessions in government warehouses. Unfortunately, many of their items were broken into and stolen. Many short and long-term effects after Japanese internment affected Japanese Americans and the U.S. government economically and politically. For example, many of the Japanese interns got sick during the internment and eventually died. This affected their families as they never got to see them again and their medical health. Another example would be the parallels between President Trump's immigration ban and Japanese internment. The executive order that was signed by President Trump limited Muslim refugee travel for 120 days on predominantly Muslim countries. Some have called the act an example of history repeating itself, as the act achieved the same goal as Japanese internment, painting Japanese people, or in this case, Muslims, as dangerous and a threat while most of them are harmless.
It's possible. It kind of comes close to it with what President Trump was advocating, with the, identifying all the, the Muslim Middle Easterners who are Muslim in this country. It appeared like that was a preliminary step toward that. So there were a great deal of concern.
President Gerald Ford stated, "Not only was this evacuation wrong, but Japanese Americans were and are loyal Americans." In this quote, Gerald Ford is stating how the Japanese Americans were loyal to the country and didn't deserve to be put into internment camps. Nonetheless, decades after the attack, in 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act to compensate more than 100,000 people of Japanese descent who were incarcerated in internment camps during World War II. The legislation offered a formal apology and paid out $20,000 in compensation to each surviving victim. This represents how the government wanted to repay for what they thought was a mistake. Anti-Japanese sentiment and racism made it seem that the Japanese would never gain back their rights and freedoms, but with the cooperation of ordinary citizens, the Japanese were able to acquire their rights again. In 1998, President Bill Clinton awarded civil rights activist Fred Korematsu the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor one could get, for Korematsu's diligence and perseverance in the fight for Japanese freedom. President Clinton was credited with saying, "In the long history of our country's constant search for justice, some names of ordinary citizens stand for millions of souls. Plessy, Brown, Parks, To that distinguished list, today we add the name of Fred Korematsu.